Okay, so this is kind of part two on last week. This won't be as long, but just kind of tie things in. I thought this would be fun. I told you guys about this last time. A website called Spurious Correlations. I printed off a few of these because I thought these were really funny. So basically, you can go on there and you can play around with different data sets to make things correlate with each other. And you can see like two graphs that look like they're like exactly identically the same. So some of the ones that people can make, I think this is great. Google searches for report UFO sightings correlates perfectly with kerosene used in South Korea.
Okay.
So the more Google searches there are for reportings of UFO sightings, the more kerosene is used in South Korea. That data is from 2004 to 2022. Okay. How about the air pollution in Iowa City and the correlate between the number of library technicians in Iowa? So the more air pollution, the more number of library technicians in Iowa.
Oh, that's because you stay indoors.
People stay indoors. That's a good thought. You could actually study that. That's what I was thinking too.
Maybe they cause the pollution.
Maybe.
Librarians.
Librarians are pretty polluted people.
Yeah.
Who knows? GMO use in corn growth, also in Iowa, correlates with Google searches for black holes. So the more people searched black holes in 2004, there was also more GMO use in corn growth in Iowa, and those two things perfectly correlate. How about the popularity of the first name Wayland with wind power generated in China? Both on the ups. I would invest heavily in either China wind or the first name Wayland.
And that means more people are naming their kid Wayland
Apparently, yeah.
than in the past.
Apparently. Babies born. This is up from 105. This is babies of all sexes born in the United States named Wayland. This is according to the U.S. Social Security Administration. So 105 in 1990 to almost 5,000 in 2020. Okay. How about the distance between Uranus and Earth correlates with asthma prevalence in American children?
Which one has the dips?
The one that has the dips is the percent of children in the U.S. with asthma.
Okay.
Yeah. So 2013 was an outlier. So maybe we have to kick that one out because it didn't perfectly match the data. I think you see where I'm driving at with this. When we try to draw conclusions, yeah, this one is another one, but I cut off the title. So I don't know if that one is. Anyway, when you try to draw conclusions when all you have is observation, you can make mistakes. And this is kind of what we talked about last week with Dr. Ansel Keys, when he was seeing that people were getting heart attacks and making the assumption that these people are getting heart attacks because we find cholesterol in their arteries. Where does cholesterol come from? Well, we make it, but we also eat it. So maybe it's that lipid hypothesis we talked about, which says that saturated fat raises cholesterol, and cholesterol then cholesterol then causes heart disease. So it's a simple thought, but it's a really effective one. And we have to put ourselves back in that time in America in 1950s, where seriously, like if you went 50 years before in the 1900s, nobody knew what a heart attack was. Nobody described in any medical journal what chest pain was. It was a completely new kind of phenomenon that started to come on at the turn of the century. And again, by the 1950s, is killing a bunch of middle-aged white dudes. And they're like struggling in a panic to figure out what are we going to do about this.
And there was nothing really they could do. It just happened and you're dead.
That there was no warning sign that they could figure out. And so if cholesterol would be a biomarker of like, wow, we finally have something we can track, and this is a warning sign, like that's what we wanted to hear. Like what would happen if during the COVID pandemic we were just like, yeah, these people are sick and dying, we don't know what's going on, and it's like years and years and years of like
people suffering.
Yeah, I don't think we did much better anyway, but like at least people like started to figure out like, okay, we got to get on top of this like now. I think it's settled because everybody wanted answers. You know, in April of 2020, like love to know what the next step forward is and would like to know how not to get sick. So anyway, Ansel Keys starts to push this idea out that it's the saturated fat. the more saturated fat you eat, the more you have risk of heart attack. We did the 7-country study, which I showed you that perfect correlational line. Do you guys need the paper do you want the paper? And what the reality was he took only the 7 countries that really supported his theory and cut everything else out, which is obviously kind of a sham, scandalous way to do science. So the problem with all of this was like the idea was being pushed forward and people were jumping on board, and Dr. Keyes had that really loud and boisterous kind of personality, but they didn't have the study that actually showed what that cholesterol and saturated fat in particular did cause heart attacks. They made correlations. They had, like we said in the 7-country study, an idea that it might, really bad science. But what they really, really, really needed was what is called a randomized controlled trial. So in a randomized controlled trial, you take 2 groups of people who are the same in every kind of logical way you can figure out that these 2 groups are the same. And then you feed one group one thing, and you feed another group another thing, and then you watch them over the course of several years. And if you've kept the variable the same besides this one thing, and you see a difference between the 2, that's how you know that this is improving. So a drug, any drug that comes to market has to go through this randomized controlled trial. So first you test it to make, what's that?
Except for COVID.
May have been pushed through a little quick, but so yeah, so I mean, a vaccine is a good idea. So your first test of a vaccine is it safe? Because if a vaccine isn't safe, then it's a non-starter. You have to stop studying the thing. So you take a small group, give them that vaccine, make sure they don't die. Okay, that's your first step. Right. The second step is like, okay, if it's safe, then we go to the next step, which is like, does this even work? You might not die from getting this vaccine, but is it going to make you any better? So you study that, slightly bigger group, test that out, and then you want to get your randomized control trial of a large group population where you take very similar people. One team, you give one person a placebo, and you follow those people for a set amount of time and see, like, is it 0% of people in the vaccine group got sick versus 50% of people got sick in the non-vaccine? Like, that's a really strong indicator that this makes a big difference. If it's like one person got better over here and 2 people got better over here, that's a really small group. You can't really show that. Although drug companies are really good at that. And what they'll say is, like, since there was 1 in this group and 2 in this group, well, that's 50%. There's a 50% reduction in harm. But if the group was 50,000 people and one had 1 and one had 2, that means nothing. It's too small. But they'll say it's the 50%. So anyway, they needed to do some type of a trial where they had people controlled for many years and fed them 2 different diets. And so they came up with this plan of how to do this study. And one particular arm of this study was done in Minnesota in the 1970s and was actually done in mental institutions. So you couldn't do this now. There's different like boards that kind of regulate ethics and things like that, and forcing somebody to eat a particular diet without them knowing would probably not pass off today as it would then, but it passed. And so what they did is they went into mental institutions. These people weren't going anywhere. They all lived the same lives, kind of walked away. But if we fed one group one kind of food and another group another kind of food and watched them for several years, this would be the definitive, evidence that eating one way would produce more heart attacks than eating another way. Very expensive, challenging to do. You have to make the food look identical. Like back in the 1960s and 70s, margarine in a lot of states, there were laws that margarine couldn't be yellow so that it couldn't like pass off for butter. So that was like a real challenge, but they figured out how to do it, and they started feeding these 2 groups of people 2 different foods. So one group got the normal saturated fat, they got the normal eggs, they got normal butter, and there was a few other things that they got that were more on the kind of like saturated fat side. The other group got a lot of the kind of newer types of foods and newer types of fats. I think there were fake eggs. There was definitely margarine. Their food was cooked in vegetable oil. They used Crisco versus using lard. And they were able to follow these people for several years. How do you think the results went?
50-50.
Think it made like no difference?
Yeah.
Okay. There was a difference. And the biggest difference was in cholesterol. When they measured the group of people that ate the vegetable oil versus the people that ate the saturated fat, the people that ate the vegetable oil had lower cholesterol.
Okay.
So that part is mission accomplished. If you eat vegetable oil, if you reduce your saturated fat, you will reduce your cholesterol level in your body. However, not only did less people die who was eating the saturated fat, but more people who were eating the vegetable oil died of what is called all-cause mortality. Meaning that's not just heart attacks, that could be a stroke or cancer. It's like we talked about last week, where it's like a cure for a heart attack could be shoot somebody in the face. They didn't die of a heart attack, but at the end, does it really matter? Like, they still died. So this was a really problematic finding for such an expensive trial that they couldn't explain away. They did such a good job doing the trial that they couldn't then say, well, this was wrong with it and this was wrong with it and we should have done it in a bigger group. Like, no, they designed the trial really, really well. The data from that study, which was, again, mid-1970s, was never published for years. The data remained kind of locked away, hidden away. One of the principal investigators of the trial said, well, there was nothing wrong with the trial. We were just very disappointed with the results. They had a hypothesis, and this basically showed that the hypothesis was wrong. If you were in love with your own ideas and hypotheses, this is terrible. You can't explain this away all of a sudden. You were the one that did the trial. So what do you do if you have, again, very good evidence saying that your ideas were wrong? One thing you can do is just not publish. Don't tell anybody. And that's what they did. So the Minnesota coronary trial, I believe is called, was published in a very obscure journal many, many years later in like 1989. Nobody read it. Nobody saw about it. Nobody figured out what had happened. And it wasn't until 2016 where a reporter kind of caught wind that this study had been done and where was the data, and they didn't know where it was. It was found eventually in the basement of one of the principal investigators, where the reporter had to call the son, who is also a doctor now, son of the original investigator, to drive to the house in like Rochester, Minnesota every weekend to dig through this basement full of all kinds of stuff this guy had collected to find the original data tapes of the original trial data that basically disproved his dad's ideas. It's a fascinating kind of story that, I mean, how would you feel if you were the son and your father had passed on and he had these really beloved ideas and you were the one to come out and like disprove all of his life's work, but it was like telling the truth. It was a really kind of, again, like a really interesting study, but the study itself was a complete failure for the people that supported saturated fat and cholesterol and that causing heart attacks. You can't even imagine the level of harm that caused if that study would have been released and we had said, okay, let's shift course. This clearly isn't working. Let's try to figure out what the cause is because it's not cholesterol. That was 50 years ago. We could have completely changed the trajectory of the health in the nation. So that was a really big landmark thing that had happened, like literally this study showing that cholesterol was not the culprit. But unfortunately, the country was catching on to this idea that it was, and people were falling in line because people were desperate. We needed answers. We needed to get this sorted out. We didn't really have time to wait for these studies that might take 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. People were dying of heart attacks now. So the next kind of big step as far as all this goes came when the United States government started to get involved. Previous to this, the United States government wasn't really making recommendations for people as far as nutrition. They had made recommendations. I think at one point, like in the 50s, there were 7 food groups and there were 5 food groups and there are 4 food groups, something like that. I may have goofed the order up, but basically they said that to have a balanced diet, you should have meat, you should have milk, you should have fruits and vegetables, and you should have grains and cereals, and just balance those out. And our health, besides the heart attacks, as a country was actually pretty good. We were really tall, which is a good indication of good nutrition. Nobody was really afraid of fat or meat or any of that kind of stuff. We just kind of ate all of the things in a balance, and things were by and large pretty fine. But in 1977, a government committee who was more in the past kind of focused on food scarcity and malnutrition. We now lived in a time where we were in the 70s. Now we had tons of calories. Food companies were making all kinds of different foods, and we went from like kind of food more on the side of food scarcity to make sure everybody had food. And now, like, wow, we've got way too much food. What are people over consuming? And exactly, exactly. And this governmental committee decided to meet up and figure out what recommendations they could make over time. If you recall the quiz that we gave in the very beginning, in fact, let me just grab this.
Did you ever do the quiz?
We had the question in here. In 1977, the US government set our original nutritional guidelines, national nutritional guidelines that were determined largely by, and then this is choose all that apply. A 2-day review, a committee led by a senator with no formal nutrition education, a review done mostly by lawyers and journalists, also without any formal nutrition education, influenced by the opinions of an ideological based biased secretary to the senator, data that was never peer reviewed or validated, and data that could not prove any clear positive evidence for the guidelines that they would set. If you recall that question, all of those ended up being true. People should have checked off all of those different things. This committee was, again, in a huge rush to try to sort this problem out. This was led by Senator McGovern. And again, he involved people like journalists and lawyers to meet together to say, what is the best thing that we can recommend for the American public? This secretary of Senator McGovern was a very much ideological based, anti-meat kind of person. He was appalled at the way animals were treated in certain areas, and just kind of had an ideological bent against consuming meat and killing animals. So he was very much kind of pro-vegetarian. He opened a vegetarian restaurant later in his career. He was the main influencer, as it turns out, in this conference where people were trying to figure out what they were going to eat. And the only guidelines they had were the guidelines that were produced by the American Heart Association in the 1960s. And so the government was perfectly accepting of the fact that they could just say, well, we'll just do what these guys do because they seem to have sorted it out. And when the government got pressed by people that were saying like, whoa, where's the evidence for any of this? None of this makes any sense. There's no good study that shows this is the right thing to do. The idea was more along the lines of, well, we've got to do something and we think this is perfectly safe. So we're just going to do it. What's the harm if we reduce cholesterol? Is that going to cause any problems? We don't think so. People can just start now by eating less red meat, eating less cholesterol, and eating more vegetables. They didn't understand if there would be recommended or consequences of that or not. People could safely do that now, and we could come up with the longer term solutions in the future. So the original guidelines for the U.S. dietary goals is what it was called in 1977, increased our carbohydrate intake to about 55 to 60% of our total calories. So carbohydrate intake was much, much lower than that before. Now it would be about 55 to 60% of total calories.
More bread, more donuts.
They were literally trying to figure this was a problem for like cookbook writers who are like making recipes based on cultures that then are like, well, now we have to have these guidelines and the Americans want the guidelines because they don't want to die of heart attacks. So now what are we going to eat? So yeah, like 6 slices of bread, how do we make that palatable when people were eating steak and potatoes or something? It was just, it was very strange. And yeah, so yes, good point. Like bread was fine, donuts are fine, pasta, rice, all those made, all of those made kind of the staple part of the diet after that. The other goal was to decrease fat intake to less than 10% of total calories and to decrease the saturated fat to less than 10% of all calories. Let me repeat that just in case I goofed that up. Decrease fat intake to less than 30% of total calories and make sure that you've decreased your saturated fat to less than 10% total calories. And that means that, again, remember in the beginning, they weren't after total fat. They were only after saturated fat. So initially, this was a swap over to reduce your intake of saturated fat and to increase polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fat to at least 10% of your caloric intake. So that is an increase of vegetable oil. We knew vegetable oil would lower your cholesterol, so eat more of that. Don't worry about or at least total fat is somewhat controlled, but yeah, less of the saturated fat. They wanted the dietary consumption of cholesterol to be less than 300 milligrams a day. That's less than 2 large eggs, as we learned about in the quiz as well. They did have a goal of reducing sugar consumption to less than 50% of total calories. And they also, this is the first ever recommendation for decreasing salt intake to 3 grams per day or less. That is still double what our current recommendation is for salt. This is quite a big shift. Again, this is now the government getting involved and making these recommendations, which eventually led to their every 5 years, they would change the recommendations, tighten them up, make them more strict, which then led to the food pyramid. We all know how that kind of went. This is when the shift between trying to avoid saturated fat then became, we need to try to avoid all fat. Yes. It was right around the nutritional guidelines when these started, we started to see a real uptick in things like obesity. We had not talked about weight loss, fat loss, obesity as being a problem until like the 1970s, 1980s. We had a problem with heart attacks, but that was like the real only thing. We didn't have tons of diabetes and mental issues and all these other things. It was only, it's a really weird inflection point right when the dietary guidelines came out from the government that now started people suffer from these other things. And these institutions like the American Heart Association and the American government were kind of locked in because like they kind of knew that increasing somebody's carbohydrates to that level, it's not great, but we also know that fat is causing heart attacks. You got to get your calories from somewhere. So what are we going to recommend? And that's where the very simplistic idea of, okay, we know that fat has 9 calories per gram, and carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. This is where what we talked about in that second episode of this with the calories. That's when the conversation shifted to now the problem is calories. People are eating too much and they get more calories per gram by eating fat than carbohydrates. So now we're going to start making recommendations on all fat. And that's when we really saw the great reduction of fat in the diet through the 80s and the 90s. This is what we call the Snackwell's generation. Do you guys remember some of those products? Any favorites that you remember from the time?
Because I think with our first child, I remember when the snack lunches came out, and it's like, wow, gotta have this. And it's just a few pieces of cracker.
Like the Lunchables or whatever?
Lunchables. Yeah. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
By Snackwell?
Yeah. Well, Snackwell's was a separate company that made cookies and crackers, and they were extremely low fat.
Okay.
And very, very low calorie. But yeah, do you remember any of the? I grew up in a cheap Mormon household. I didn't get any name brand.
I didn't get stuff like that. It was all made from home.
Yeah.
And then you become an adult and you don't have time and you just go out and buy. And then you buy stuff for your kids that you didn't have growing up.
Yeah.
But then most of that stuff wasn't around anyway.
Yeah.
When we were growing up.
Yeah, exactly. Once these changes happen so fast and these assumptions are baked in, you stop questioning them. It's like you hear the phrase all the time, fruits and vegetables are good for you. And that very well may be true. They probably are really great for a lot of people. But when you keep asking more questions, say, well, who said that? Or where did that get said? And who did the study? You find that that's just something people have been saying for a long time. There's not any evidence that says that that's true or not. Definitely, certainly better than eating the crap that most people eat anyway. We should eat more fruits and vegetables, but if you continue saying a thing for so long, you just assume it to be true. It's almost like if I told you from the first time you saw a red car that red cars are really fast, and I just kept saying red cars are fast, you would just accept it as truth, and you wouldn't think that, well, maybe it's not the red that makes a car fast. Maybe a black car could also be fast. It's just that we paint a lot of fast-looking cars and sport cars red because that looks fast. You know what I mean? And that's what happened. That's what
it's the attitude of the driver. If they think they're in a cool car,
that's kind of what the advertising companies figured out. Like when they were more honest with things like cigarettes, they would talk about the benefits of cigarettes and how they'd open up the lungs and be really good for you. And then they learned like, wait, people don't care about what weren't facts, but they thought were facts.
Push that cigarettes would make you slimmer.
Yes, they did, but it was a shift from like, let's list off the benefits of cigarettes will make you slimmer and make you have better lungs to like, they don't talk anything about that, but they show the very slim women who are super cool and they were smoking. And so you made that association as well. It wasn't just, yes, it makes you slimmer, but it's also like, wow, look at that, all those slim people, and they're all smoking cigarettes. It's kind of that same idea. And they figured that out. And they did that with cigarettes. When cigarettes fell out of vogue, all the cigarette companies purchased the food companies who just ran the same things with sugar. That's why.
And then, yes, the advertising is thin people so that you want to be like these thin people. But now the advertising is all showing fat people.
You're true.
And yet the medications and the food may not make you slimmer, but you feel more comfortable
Yeah.
doing whatever, fitting in.
Yep. Great point. These are all just tactics to try to sell products essentially. And so again, it's this weird convergence of we think that cholesterol is causing heart attacks. That cholesterol is coming from saturated fat, so let's lower that. So everybody's on board. The American Heart Association is like, yep, we're on board. They got paid by the companies to make the alternate product, which is vegetable oil. So they're definitely on board. We're going to make more products and sell it to people. You have now the government getting on board. Then you start to come up with development of drugs. So now we find that we have certain drugs that will also lower your cholesterol. Okay, if people take that, now the drug companies make a bunch of money. So all of these things are like working together and producing this like machine that's making tons and tons and tons of money from an idea that was just never proven. But again, if you just repeat the same idea over and over and over and over again, people stop questioning it and they just start following that path. And that's exactly what we did. So by the time it was, I believe this cover was 1984. Maybe you remember it from Time magazine that showed the plate with eggs and the frowny face with a piece of bacon. And this was like the definitive kind of study. They did a study about cholesterol and cholesterol lowering medications. They told two groups of people to lower the cholesterol in their diets, but one group took a cholesterol lowering medication, the other didn't. When the cholesterol lowering medication group that worked, they said, okay, definitive. Now we know, eat less cholesterol and take drugs to lower your cholesterol. They didn't change the diet between the two. It was never a diet study, but they used that to say this is the definitive final answer. Cholesterol causes heart attacks. And again, we all know the food pyramid. How about the Mediterranean diet? Did anybody remember like thinking that fat was bad for you and you did the low fat and the food kind of tasted pretty gross if you're trying to cook at home, but like all of a sudden people started like dipping bread in olive oil. I remember that it was kind of like a Olive Garden type of a restaurant where they had bread that they would bring out. And I went with a cyclist buddy of mine who was older than me. I thought he was so cool because he would take a plate and dump all this olive oil and then he would dip his bread in it. And I was like, what are you doing? I was like 16 at the time. He's like, yeah, this is what like the Italians do. And I was like, wow, that's so fancy. That's so cool. We started to kind of get this weird kind of idea that olive oil was like super, super healthy and that would be a healthy part of the diet, which may not be wrong, but now you're up against a cohort of people that are trying to get rid of all fat in people's diets. And again, you just had a bunch of food that wasn't very good and not very palatable. You couldn't make cookbooks around it very well. Now all of a sudden, well, this fat might actually be really good, and this makes your food taste better. Let's start to explore this. And this is where we started to kind of get into the Mediterranean diet itself, which is very interesting because when most of us think of the Mediterranean diet, like what do you guys think of when you think of Mediterranean diet?
Salad.
Artichokes.
Artichokes. Yeah.
Feta,
Olives.
Feta cheese, olives,
pita bread.
pita bread,
I don't know about meat. Lamb.
Cheese.
lamb, cheese on there.
Mozzarella.
Yep.
Prosciutto.
Prosciutto, cured meat. Yeah, some. We have to distinguish. This is where it gets really weird. We have to distinguish the foods that are eaten in the Mediterranean
Right.
versus the Mediterranean diet, because one is culture related and the other is an invention. So if you go to the Mediterranean, all of those things you guys named are eaten. but sometimes not always in the same place. We kind of talked about this last time. Pita bread, olives, feta cheese, lamb might be more grease. And even in grease, that might be certain parts of grease, not all of grease. Prosciutto, olive oil, that's maybe more Italy. What about the southern part of France? What do they eat? What about the Basque country of
Brilliant.
Spain? They eat a little bit more kind of tomato based, a little bit more
They
beans.
usually eat what they make in their region.
Yep, exactly. Exactly. Mediterranean is huge. And nobody talks about, I mean, everybody like fantasizes about the European part of the Mediterranean. Traveled south, now you've got the African part of the Mediterranean. What do people eat in Morocco? What do people eat in Egypt and Chad? Like that's a huge region with vastly different diets that are not necessarily at the time, especially, and even to this day, they don't care. Nobody counts calories in these countries. They make recipes that have been handed down from ground for generations. Ask like, what's the protein? What's the
This is
fat
heart
content? Is this heart healthy or not? Like, no, they eat the recipes that they found. They know their cooking methods and what to season things with. And yeah, there's all kinds of other factors that are not just like how many calories, how much fat, whatever. You get slapped if you walked into an Italian home that you were invited in and they were putting olive oil on something. You're like, oh, that's too many calories, too much fat. I can't have that. Like, kick you right out. Um, so what happened was this confluence of we're in America, we've got this really crappy diet, this low fat diet. People are getting bigger, they're starting to gain more weight. So we're telling people to exercise. This is where again we see an uptick in exercise and the jogging craze is all kind of happening in the same time. It could be the diet had totally failed because they'd been so invested in that. But along with this confluence, in the Mediterranean, there were olive oil producers that were kind of recognizing the issue and starting to say, like, hey, there's an opportunity here. If we can get olive oil into the American diet at a greater level, this could be the fat that replaces all the other fats that got replaced. So what happened was these olive oil companies would host these wonderful, best ever, amazing nutrition conferences. And they would fly reporters over from the States to come to the hills in Italy and be treated to the best weather and the best scenery and these wonderful plates of amazing food and olive oil, just bathing in all of it. And it was like finally food that has taste, and this part in Italy doesn't seem to have a problem with heart attacks. So maybe this is a special fat that is like good for people's heart health. It was wonderful. And there was like this unwritten rule that like the journalists who returned back to the United States, they had to write about it or they would never get invited back. And again, these were amazing conferences. And so of course, you fly somebody over and say how good your product is, and they taste it and go, wow, that's amazing. They're going to start writing about it. So this is where in the early 90s, the Mediterranean diet started to take off. It was defined not by the culture, but by different metrics. I told you last week that the way that people collected data when they did the 7-country study was very inconsistent. Basically, they would look through all this food that was different aspects of food. They would kind of melt it all down, and then they would see like, okay, how much protein is in a serving of this? How much fat is in a serving of all this? How many carbohydrates? They wouldn't say like, okay, this is a cup of beans and 2 onions and some goat and some lamb. It was just the macronutrient kind of breakdown. And they saw like, okay, this looks like, maybe they ate goat and lamb in Greece, but when we ground it all up and analyzed it, that looks like chicken and fish. It's about the same. Not what they eat there, but we're going to start to sell that here because people don't eat goat and lamb here. So all of a sudden, the chicken industry and our chicken consumption goes through the roof. Fish is now heart healthy, and we start eating more of that than we ever have. Sharp decline in any red meat consumption continues to go down. But the big change that we made, and this largely came from Walter Willett at Harvard promoting the Mediterranean diet, is that there was in the food pyramid that they came up with an allowance for monounsaturated fats like olive oil. So that was the reintroduction of more fat into the diet that kind of made us go, wow, Mediterranean, this is super, super, super healthy. When maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And at very least, it got more fat in our diet, but if we would have chased the right thing from the very beginning, we wouldn't have gotten into that mess where they had to make those types of compromises. There have been several studies of Mediterranean diet that show kind of mixed benefit, nothing too conclusive. Other diets perform much better at certain things depending on what they're measuring. But the whole point of all this is when we decided to chase after saturated fat as the cause of heart disease, just that one thing and not looking at anything else that might go wrong with somebody, we ended up having to go down the path of, okay, saturated fat is bad. Now all fat is bad. Now maybe we can make some exceptions for other fat is bad. All the while we've created all these other conditions that are on the rise, getting worse all the time, harming people all over the place. Nothing to say about kids who are growing, nothing to say about none of the studies done in women. It was just like, we're just going to try to solve heart attacks. And again, to kind of tie this all up, that question that I put in the quiz, heart attacks in the 1950s used to be the #1 killer in America. What is it today? It is still heart attacks. Just boggling to think that all of this rigmarole did nothing for the original problem and caused all these other problems on the side. Carbohydrate consumption went through the roof. We eat way more vegetable oil than we ever have. That's gone through the roof. And yeah, it's
Well, and now we eat more olive oil. So are we wrong to eat the olive oil?
great question. I'm not going to come out and say no. The big olive oil itself is a monounsaturated fat, so it's less susceptible to oxidation and inflammation that it causes in the body than a polyunsaturated. So I would say certainly any olive oil you can get is 10 times better than vegetable oil. If you said, all right, I'm walking away from this conversation, I'm feeling confident that I'm going to use olive oil for my cooking and salads and things like that, I would say that's probably a huge step in the right direction if you were using soybean oil, corn oil, canola oil. Awesome. Do that. That's fine. The big problem that we have is a problem we've had with olive oil since the very beginning, when they tried to produce it industrially, is that a lot of olive oil that we have now is adulterated. So olive oil is an expensive kind of product, difficult to extract. Well, it's easy to extract because all you do is squeeze olives.
But if you heat it, you kill it or something.
If you heat it, you're introducing the heat, which is then introducing oxidation. It does so much lower being a monounsaturated fat because it only has that one double
I
bond.
meant for producing it.
Oh, yeah. Ask the question again.
The press
Yes.
to do that, but if they introduce heat to do the press,
Yes. Great.
That-
Yes. Okay. I get your question. Yes. So wherever possible, when you're shopping for olive oil, you want to try to look for first virgin press, virgin olive oil, extra virgin olive oil, first cold press. There's no heat. It's just, we're just going to squeeze something and oil's going to drip out. You really also want to look for this olive oil is coming from, if you could find it, like this property. This region is okay. This property is much better. But the wider and wider and wider the circle of where this olive oil came from, like, oh, this came from California. Where in California? This came from the United States. So where in the United States? The wider and wider that gets, the more likely your olive oil is cut or diluted with seed oils.
yeah.
So the problem isn't is seed oil or is olive oil, excuse me, good for you. It's whether or not you can even find
It's pure.
exactly. Good olive oil will always come in a dark container, whether it's translucent or opaque. So it doesn't let light in because again, that will oxidize your oil. Good olive oil should, when you taste it, should sting the back of your mouth. So that's a way that you can taste it and kind of see if you get that like stinging sensation. Another way that you can test your olive oil is to put it in the fridge. We learned when we talked about the different kinds of fats that saturated fat is solid at room temperature. Monounsaturated fat is kind of in the middle. And in an oil, polyunsaturated oil like vegetable oil, it's always going to be kind of oily. You can put it in the fridge and expose it to colder temperatures, and it's going to be an oil, which is why fish oil, like we talked about, fish oil is being something that's good for us in omega-3s, comes from fish. That's the fat that fish use, because if they use saturated fat and they swam in cold waters, that fat would solidify and they would sink. Like literally, they need polyunsaturated oil in that state so that the oil doesn't get cold and then harden, essentially. But basically what you can do is take your olive oil, put it in the fridge overnight, and then in the morning it should be cloudy. You should see that there's some cloudiness to it. So those are ways you can test olive oil to see if it's like a true product. It still is risky. I would just always go back to when you're cooking, I would just cook with good old fashioned butter, if nothing else. If you like tallow or lard or whatever, the idea that saturated fat, again, causes heart disease has not ever been proven once. I would just go back to safe cooking oils like butter, coconut oil, lard, tallow, any fat from bacon grease is fine. However, if you told me, no, I really like to cook with olive oil, say that's fine. And then I would want to know the length of time for cooking and the temperature for cooking. And it's just a question of risk. If you every day are frying potatoes that are coated in olive oil at 450 degrees for an hour, probably not going to be the best. If you're doing it and it's just like you're heating up some vegetables in a saute and it's a few minutes at a lower temperature, I don't think you have anything to worry about.
Yeah.
Same with like avocado oil. Some people like that as well, but I don't think you have anything to worry about as far as that goes. It's so weird. Again, you can kind of see so many of the implications of like when we followed the advice, which we did. That's the other diagram you're going to see on that handout is like we ate more of the white meat, we ate way less of the red meat, ate more fruits and vegetables, more carbohydrates, less of the fatty foods, more vegetable oils. It's just like now we have epidemics of obesity and diabetes and mental issues and behavioral problems in kids and ADHD, you name it. It's just
But they never really came out and said the sugar was bad.
people have tried and yeah, they even the government, like even today, this has been true for like 20 years or 25 years. And the nutritional guidelines that they produce, like they walked away from low fat in the guidelines. Like as of like 20 or the year 2000, if you read the guidelines, they may have not even said like you should eat a low fat diet because they knew it didn't work. But they didn't come out and tell everybody. They didn't say like, hey, everybody got this wrong. Sorry, add the fat back in because if not, you're going to eat tons of carbohydrates and all these other things are going to happen. And so, yeah, people over the years have tried to say like sugar itself is probably not the best thing with all of this. And if you can replace it with other forms of carbohydrate, that might be better. But again, it's so just the idea of you eat cholesterol, it gets in your body, and the phrase you always hear, it clogs your arteries. Everybody knows that. That's exactly what happens. And we all know that happens. And so that's our bias towards it. And to get people thinking that maybe it's a little bit more difficult and complicated than that is really challenging. So whether any of this stuff
into it.
What's that?
They all bought into it. Everybody.
Well, they kept it secret, quiet,
Why would you not keep it secret and quiet? Because
because you're getting paid.
yeah, we were the ones that bought into it, right? Hand over fist, like buying the foods, getting the prescriptions, doing the procedures, all of it just it is incredible.
As well as the addiction of those certain foods. And
The way they do it now, like you think like inventing a new food or new flavor of food would be like a demand for like a new flavor or something. But really it's like a bunch of food scientists who know the chemical compositions and addictiveness of different foods sit down and say, okay, we want a product. I want to say that this product is low fat. I want to say this product is heart healthy. I want to get the maximum amount of salt and sugar and fat combined to hit the exact centers of your brain that find this amazing combination of food that you would never, ever, ever find in nature. Those never come together. They're maximally a donut. They call it the Dorito effect. Like Doritos are so good. Like they're sweet, they're salty, they're savory, all those things we talked about. They engineer that food and then they reverse engineer to make sure they can still have the heart healthy claim, which you can buy from the American Heart Association. If you make the serving size lower, you can say that it's low calorie.
even though they know you're going to eat 3 times as much.
Who's gonna eat a serving of Doritos? Like
One
10 chips.
Dorito chip.
I think it's about 10.
10 Dorito chips have never been consumed in the history of Dorito chips. The last time I sat down to chips and salsa. I was with Bethany's family. This is probably 2018. We were visiting the chips and salsa. We were eating and we were eating and talking. And it's like before long, you're done with the entire bag. And you're like, how did that happen? I'm not full at all. And we just got through the whole bag. And it's like, yeah. Everybody's making money on this idea and they can just continue pushing it forward because it's still to this day supported by the American Heart Association, still encourages vegetable oil consumption, lowering saturated fat. If you want grant money, if you want to be in their good graces, you either accept that and move forward and get your name on a study, or you are shunned and you have to figure out how to earn money for your own study. Which
Kind of like the group has become so big and powerful that they're all just telling lies, but nobody will question them.
if you do, your career is done. They would literally end your career. You're not going to get invited. You're not going to have studies anymore. It's just going to be over. So it's a bad place that we ended up getting to. But yeah, again, the whole idea of like what we really should be doing is going back and questioning the original idea that we thought might be right that was never proven, which is, does saturated fat cause heart disease? It's crazy. Awesome. Thanks for coming, guys. We're off next week, so enjoy time off.